The executive, the political executive. So we're back at this slide again because not only does the cabinet form the active part of the Queen's Privy Council of Canada, which is supposed to provide advice to the Governor-General, but in reality never does. On the political side, along with the Prime Minister and the Ministers of State, the cabinet forms the political executive. These are Canada's most powerful politicians. This said, it just happened that way organically. The Constitution actually has nothing to say about its existence and operation. The cabinet therefore runs entirely under the cloak of custom and constitutional convention. This means that these are politically but not legally binding practices, and occasionally under usage of the Constitution, which is non-binding. The political executive therefore takes much of its direction from the convention rather than statute. Given that divisions of power between the Prime Minister and the Cabinet aren't formal, the relative amount of power Cabinet has in relation to the Prime Minister can be variable. This is a depiction of Pierre Elliott Trudeau's Cabinet. The Prime Minister is sometimes referred to as the First Minister to indicate the leadership role in the Cabinet. Remember that King's councillors were privy to secrets, so they formed the Privy Council. And even though today the Privy Council that counsels the Governor-General representing the King is defunct, Cabinet is still the Privy Council, which is why it's formally known as the Governor-General in Council or Governor in Council. A Cabinet decision is known as a Minute of Council, and a decision taken by virtue of the power delegated to the Cabinet is known as an Order in Council. Many of the executive functions of the Cabinet are undertaken in the name of the Governor-General or the Governor-in-Council. These include some prerogative powers devolved to ministers, such as the appointment of privy councillors, judges and senators, involvement in international affairs, and the power of clemency or pardon given to federal offenders. Canada's Westminster system is only one way of doing it. As we've seen already, Nunavut and the Northwestern Territories don't have political parties. Candidates run as independents, and the Premier and Cabinet are elected by all the members of Legislative Assembly by secret ballot. Nunavut and the Northwest Territories also have stronger legislatures that can control Cabinet, unlike the case in Canada and the provinces. The book also describes other Westminster variations in Australia and New Zealand and the United Kingdom, and it points to systems that have evolved more rapidly than in Canada. Here, our system is extremely conservative, and power is concentrated in the hands of the Prime Minister. Canada has a number of what the book calls categories of office in the ministry. Here, the ministry refers to the Cabinet and those people that assist Cabinet ministers, so junior ministers called Ministers of State or Secretaries of State. The first, most obvious category is the Prime Minister. The most powerful of ministers, he sets the agenda and priorities of government. The second are again the ministers. Each minister heads one or more service departments of government. Ministers that lead service departments are called line ministers. Other times, ministers head portfolios and policy coordination departments. Third are ministers of state. These are junior ministers assigned specific duties to assist senior cabinet ministers in their portfolios. They are members of the Privy Council, but not members of the cabinet, and unlike ministers, they don't oversee any area of the public service. Under Stephen Harper, these junior ministers can attend cabinet committee meetings relevant to their areas of responsibility. They also represent ministers at events and meetings. Below that, parliamentary secretaries are government party members chosen by the Prime Minister to assist a minister or more than one. They act as liaisons between the minister and the Commons, as well as the general public. They are not part of cabinet, and they do not attend cabinet meetings or have access to cabinet documents. This is a portrait of our current cabinet. You could envision ministers as CEOs of different government departments. I've listed the most important government departments here, along with their respective minister, in presumptive order, which is the government's polite way of saying order of importance. I myself have questions about how this list is formed, but it gives you an idea of the machinery of government. Here are the departments. We discussed this briefly when looking at the history of government in Canada. Responsible government underpins the legitimacy of the government in the eyes of the public. Responsible government is composed of two related aspects: individual ministerial responsibility and collective responsibility. Below this clip, there's an outstanding documentary based on a book written by Canadian author John Ralston Saul. It tells the story of Louis Hippolyte Lafontaine and Robert Baldwin's struggle for democracy in Canada.
Does Your Majesty really agree that your Governor-General, the Queen's own Viceroy in Canada, should be overruled by the elected members?
Yes, Lord Melbourne. We assure you we do agree.
You mean to say that Victoria of Great Britain would give up her royal power to some obscure politician from Montreal or Toronto?
Lord Melbourne, Monsieur Lafontaine and Mr. Baldwin are trying to bring harmony to the colony with this... What do they call it, Lord Melbourne?
Responsible government, ma'am.
Responsible government. Just so. Now, suppose we do not assent, Prime Minister.
Well, that could mean another rebellion in the Canadas.
Responsible government. Our Governor-General controlled by an elected assembly instead of by us. It's a Canadian idea.
Pity, ma'am.
Very well, Lord Melbourne. We think we know what we must do.
Individual responsibility implies that a minister is responsible to the House of Commons. How? The minister is responsible to submit his or her department's cost estimates and plans, defend them there, and answer questions related to the aspects of the department's operations. If the minister fails to solve problems in their department that they know of, or if they are found guilty of improper behavior, the minister is supposed to resign. Improper behavior includes misleading Parliament, authorizing reasonable use of executive power, or engaging in immoral conduct or conduct unbecoming of a minister of the Crown. The book gives examples, such as when, in 1978, Solicitor General Francis Fox resigned after forging his mistress's husband's signature so that she could get an abortion. Defense Minister Maxime Bernier, who we learned about when we looked at his People's Party of Canada, was forced to resign in 2008 when he left classified documents at his girlfriend's house for 5 weeks. He broke up with her during that time, and it turned out that she had links to the Hells Angels. Minister John Duncan resigned after he contacted a tax court judge on behalf of a constituent. President of the Privy Council, Peter Panashway, resigned over illegal campaign contributions to his campaign fund. More recently, our last Finance Minister, Bill Morneau, resigned over alleged misuse of COVID relief funds. More often than not, we're very bad at holding ministers to account. Not so long ago, International Development Minister Beverly Oda was found guilty of doctoring documents to mislead Parliament about charity organizations. And when looking back at Defense Minister Maxime Bernier, he did lose his defense position, but then he became Minister of Tourism. Collective responsibility is about the responsibility that the Cabinet as a whole has towards the monarch, the responsibility that Cabinet has towards itself, and the responsibility that Cabinet has towards the House of Commons. The responsibility that Cabinet has to the monarch is basically a pledge that Cabinet must honor with the monarch's representative, the Governor-General. Cabinet must encourage the Governor-General in their job and consult and warn the Governor-General of anything important going on in government. It just means that Cabinet has a duty to keep the Governor-General updated and consulted on the work of government. If the Governor-General takes undemocratic decisions or otherwise falls out of line, it is also the Cabinet's responsibility to resign. Cabinet is responsible to itself in a few ways. Ministers must avoid public disagreements over policy. If they differ in their opinion in the Cabinet room, once a decision has been reached, they have to vote in unison in the House. In fact, as the book mentions, there must not be even a hint of dissent within Cabinet ranks. Strategically, this is important because any hint of division in the Cabinet can easily lead to defeat of a government. If a minister cannot abide by a decision made in Cabinet, the minister must resign. Lucien Bouchard withdrew from Brian Mulroney's cabinet in 1990 because he couldn't accept changes to the Meech Lake Accord. Michael Chong resigned from Stephen Harper's cabinet in 2005 because he could not support the government's motion recognizing the Québécois as a nation. Joe Camuzzi resigned in 2005 because he could not accept the government's same-sex marriage bill. The textbook is right. Very few ministers in Canadian history have resigned, though. In all, there have been 26 out of over 700 past ministers, and it seems to be getting more rare over time. Michael Chong was Stephen Harper's only resigned minister. Former Prime Minister Paul Martin, likewise, had only one. Jean Chrétien had none. Brian Mulroney had 2. When our current Prime Minister lost 2 at once, this was historic. Only the 4th time in Canadian history that a Prime Minister lost multiple ministers as a result of a single decision. The incident revolved around attempts by the Trudeau government to get the Canadian Attorney General and Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould to override a decision to prosecute SNC-Lavalin on bribery charges related to contracts in Libya. Raybould refused, citing the principle that the justice system needs to remain independent from political government. This is an important principle related to rule of law. After being unsuccessfully pressured by the Prime Minister's office to intervene in the judiciary, Wilson-Raybould was given another ministerial position. She interpreted this as punishment, and so she subsequently resigned. She was followed by Jane Philpott, who resigned once she found that the Prime Minister made the wrong decision in handling events with the Justice Minister. Cabinet responsibility to itself is also through Cabinet secrecy. What happens at Cabinet meetings stays at Cabinet meetings. All ministers take an oath of secrecy, and that way they can speak freely at the meetings without fearing that what they say might be leaked to the public. Note that if Cabinet is trying to hide malfeasance, this isn't protected, but the way in which they arrive at decisions is protected. Cabinet secrecy also works to protect the anonymity of public servants. Their advice to ministers is always made in confidence. That way the public can attribute Cabinet decisions to the government and not the civil service. The government is always responsible for their decisions. The book actually forgets to discuss the third element of collective responsibility, the confidence convention. I think that this part fell out because it's really important. This is the responsibility that Cabinet holds towards the House of Commons. It's worth underlining since it's the most important aspect of Cabinet collective responsibility. Basically, Cabinet is responsible to ensure that their decisions are accepted by the majority of parliamentarians in the House of Commons when put to a vote. If a fundamental piece of legislation put forward by Cabinet does not achieve a majority vote in the House of Commons, the House is dissolved and elections are called. Why? This is the fundamental essence of our democracy. We choose representatives who represent us at the House of Commons. If our chosen representatives do not agree with the decisions made by Cabinet, then Cabinet has lost the confidence of the House and by extension ourselves. Without our consent in this form, there is no democracy. Third time's the charm. Finally, after avoiding a vote of non-confidence twice by proroguing Parliament, the Harper government was brought down in March of 2011. This time because the Prime Minister failed to disclose full financial details of his tougher crime legislation, failed to disclose corporate tax cuts, and failed to disclose plans to purchase fighter stealth jets. Here's the footage of what a vote of non-confidence looks like.
You know, the truth is we can't predict even when this darn thing's going to start, but more importantly, we can't predict when the darn thing's, how it's going to end. And of course, as you say, it's easy to get lost in the weeds here, but nonetheless, the consequences of this are big. And you remember when you first started covering this, it's pretty exciting on the inside right now.
No, there's no question about that, and I can see it on Rosie's face. She's over there. Well, here we go.
Oh, here we go. Let's get to it. The countdown clock finally pays off. Mr. O'Connor, the whips, and they are talking to each other and shaking hands as they begin what will be the procedure towards this non-confidence vote over contempt. Let's listen in. It will be very interesting what the Speaker says.
The question is on the previous question on the motion of Mr. Ignatieff relating to the business of supply. The Honourable Chief Government Whip is rising on a point of order.
I'll try this again, Mr. Speaker. I believe that you will find unanimous consent of the House that the previous question moved earlier today be withdrawn.
Unanimous consent to proceed in this fashion? The motion is then withdrawn. The next question, therefore, is as follows. Mr. Ignatieff, seconded by Mr. Goodale, move that the House agree with the finding of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs that the government is in contempt of Parliament, which is unprecedented in Canadian parliamentary history, and consequently the House has lost confidence in the government. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion? All those in favour of the motion will please say yea.
All those opposed will please say nay. In my opinion, the yeas have it.
Okay. All those in favor of the motion will please rise.
Mr. Ignatieff. Mr. Dion.
Ms. Guarnieri. Mr. McCauley. Mr. Volpe. Mr. Easter. Ms. Fry. Mr. Regan. Ms. Mina. Mr. Ray. Mr. McGuinty. Mr. Goodale. Mr. Bélanger. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Karagiannis. Mr. Lee. Mr. Canis. Mr. Mali. Ms. Bennett. Mr. Kodal. Mr. Bryson. Mr. Kotler. Ms. Scroll. Mr. McCallum. Mr. Desange. Ms. Foote. Mr. Proulx. Ms. Ratansi. Mr. Dryden. Mr. McTague. Mr. Patry. Mr. Szabo. Madame Folco. Madame Jennings. Mr. McKay Scarborough-Gilwood. Mr. Wilford. Mr. Bagnall. Mr. Cuzner. Mr. Eiking. Mr. Leblanc. Mr. Murphy Charlottetown. Ms. Neville. Mr. Tonks. Mr. Pachetti. Mr. Baines. Mr. Damour. Ms. Dalla. Mr. Holland. Mr. Rodriguez. Mr. Rota. Mr. Savage. Mr. Scarpalegia. Mr. Silva. Mr. Sims. Mr. Jesnevsky. Mr. Russell. Mr. Dollywall. Mr. Murphy Moncton Riverview Dieppe. Mr. Pearson. Ms. Hall Finley. Ms. Murray. Mr. Andrews. Ms. Cody. Mrs. Crombie. Ms. Duncan Etobicoke North. Mr. Garneau. Mr. Kanya. Mr. Kennedy. Madame Mendez. Mr. Oliphant. Mrs. Simpson. Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Valeriot. Madame Zarak. Mr. Lamoureux. Monsieur Duceppe.
Monsieur Duceppe.
Monsieur Bachand. Monsieur Paillet-Hochelaga. Monsieur Paquette. Madame Lalonde. Monsieur Bigra. Monsieur Ménard. Monsieur Bouchard. Monsieur Lessard.
Monsieur Lessard.
Monsieur Laforêt.
Monsieur Laforêt.
Monsieur Laframboise.
Laframboise.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame Gagnon.
Madame Gagnon.
Monsieur Lemay.
Monsieur Lemay.
Madame Brunel.
Madame Brunel.
Madame Gay.
Madame Gay.
Madame Bourgeois.
Madame Bourgeois.
Madame Demers.
Madame Demers.
Monsieur Blais.
Monsieur Blais.
Monsieur Bellavance.
Monsieur Bellavance.
Monsieur Cardin.
Monsieur Cardin.
Madame Faye.
Madame Faye.
Madame Lavallée.
Madame Lavallée.
Monsieur Plamondon.
Monsieur Plamondon.
Madame Freeman.
Madame Freeman.
Monsieur Saint-Cyr.
Monsieur Saint-Cyr.
Monsieur Malo.
Monsieur Malo.
Monsieur Nadeau.
Monsieur Nadeau.
Monsieur Carrier.
Monsieur Carrier.
Monsieur Lévesque.
Monsieur Lévesque.
Monsieur Asselin.
Monsieur Asselin.
Monsieur André.
Monsieur André.
Madame Mourani.
Madame Mourani.
Monsieur Godet.
Monsieur Godet.
Madame Bonsang.
Madame Bonsang.
Monsieur Vincent.
Monsieur Vincent.
Monsieur Ouellet.
Monsieur Ouellet.
Madame Tillac.
Madame Tillac.
Monsieur Dufour.
Monsieur Dufour.
Monsieur Guimont, Rimouski, Négette, Témiscouata, les Basques.
Monsieur Guimont, Rimouski, Négette, Témiscouata, les Basques.
Monsieur Paillé, Louis Hébert.
Monsieur Paillé, Louis Hébert.
Monsieur Dorion.
Monsieur Dorion.
Monsieur Desnoyers.
Monsieur Desnoyers.
Monsieur Pomerleau.
Monsieur Pomerleau.
Madame Baudin.
Madame Baudin.
Mr. Layton.
Mr. Layton.
Monsieur Mulcair.
Mr. Mulcair.
Miss Davies, Vancouver East.
Davies, Vancouver East.
Mr. Martin, Winnipeg Center.
Mr. Martin, Winnipeg Center.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Harrison, Johns East.
Mr. Harrison, Johns East.
Mr. Martin, Sault Ste. Marie.
Mr. Martin, Sault Ste. Marie.
Monsieur Godin.
Mr. Godin.
Mr. Comartin.
Mr. Comartin.
Miss Crowder.
Miss Crowder.
Mr. Christopherson.
Mr. Christopherson.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Miss Charlton.
Miss Charlton.
Mr. Cullen.
Mr. Cullen.
Mr. Sixay.
Mr. Sixay.
Miss Matheson.
Miss Matheson.
Mr. Bevington.
Mr. Bevington.
Madame Savoie.
Madame Savoie.
Mr. Dewar.
Mr. Dewar.
Mr. Malloway.
Mr. Malloway.
Mr. Allen Welland.
Mr. Allen Welland.
Ms. Ashton.
Ms. Ashton.
Mr. Davies, Vancouver Kingsway.
Mr. Davies, Vancouver Kingsway.
Mr. Adamanenko.
Mr. Adamanenko.
Mr. Donnelly.
Mr. Donnelly.
Ms. Duncan, Edmonton Strathcona.
Duncan, Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Gravel.
Mr. Gravel.
Madame Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Mr. Heyer.
Mr. Heyer.
Mr. Stoffer.
Mr. Stoffer.
Mr. Marston.
Mr. Marston.
Ms. Chow.
Ms. Chow.
Mr. Rafferty.
Mr. Rafferty.
Mr. Thibault.
Mr. Thibault.
Ms. Leslie.
Ms. Leslie.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Mr. Harper. Mr. Fletcher. Mrs. Oblonsky. Ms. Rake. Mr. Ashfield. Mr. Van Loan. Mr. Taves. Mr. Daves. Mr. Nicholson. Mr. McKay Central Nova. Mr. Baird. Mr. Cannon Pontiac. Mr. Flaherty. Mr. Clement. Mr. Straw. Ms. Finley. Mr. Ritz. Mrs. Mr. Kenny, Calgary Southeast.
Mr. Kenny, Calgary Southeast.
Mr. Moore, Port Moody, Westwood, Port Coquitlam.
Mr. Moore, Port Moody, Westwood, Port Coquitlam.
Mr. Paradis.
Mr. Paradis.
Mrs. Aglukak.
Mrs. Aglukak.
Mr. Blackburn.
Mr. Blackburn.
Mr. Duncan, Vancouver Island North.
Mr. Duncan, Vancouver Island North.
Mr. Kent.
Mr. Kent.
Mr. Abbott.
Mr. Abbott.
Mr. Richardson.
Mr. Richardson.
Mr. Benoit.
Mr. Benoit.
Mr. Brightcrite.
Mr. Brightcrite.
Mr. Thompson.
Mr. Thompson.
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Petty, South Shore, St. Margaret.
Mr. Petty, South Shore, St. Margaret.
Mr. Warawa.
Mr. Warawa.
Mr. McKenzie.
Mr. McKenzie.
Mr. Fantino.
Mr. Fantino.
Mr. Goodyear.
Mr. Goodyear.
Mr. Merrifield.
Merrifield.
Mrs. Yelich.
Mrs. Yelich.
Madame Verner.
Madame Verner.
Mr. O'Connor.
Mr. O'Connor.
Ms. Ambrose.
Ms. Ambrose.
Ms. Oda.
Ms. Oda.
Monsieur Lebel.
Mr. Lebel.
Mr. Moore, Fundy Royal.
Moore, Fundy Royal.
Mr. Lunn.
Mr. Lunn.
Mr. Menzies.
Mr. Menzies.
Mr. Camp, Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge Mission.
Mr. Camp, Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge Mission.
Mr. Dykstra.
Mr. Dykstra.
Mr. Del Mastro.
Mr. Del Mastro.
Mr. Gould.
Mr. Gould.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Harris, Caribou, Prince George.
Harris, Caribou, Prince George.
Mr. Cummins.
Mr. Cummins.
Mr. Anders.
Mr. Anders.
Mr. Casson.
Mr. Casson.
Mr. Goldring. Mr. Bernier.
Mr. Bernier.
Mr. Chong. Mr. Velicott. Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Rickford.
Mr. Rickford.
Mr. Kerr.
Mr. Kerr.
Mr. O'Bry.
O'Bry.
Mr. Petit.
Mr. Petit.
Mr. Hahn.
Mr. Hahn.
Mr. Poiliev.
Mr. Poiliev.
Mr. Lukiski.
Mr. Lukiski.
Mrs. Wong.
Mrs. Wong.
Mrs. Glover.
Mrs. Glover.
Madame Boucher.
Madame Boucher.
Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Jean.
Mr. Jean.
Mr. Komarnicki.
Mr. Komarnicki.
Mr. Lemieux.
Mr. Lemieux.
Mr. Saxton.
Mr. Saxton.
Mr. Deckert.
Mr. Deckert.
Ms. Brown, Newmarket Aurora.
Ms. Brown, Newmarket Aurora.
Mrs. McLeod.
Mrs. McLeod.
Mr. Lunny.
Mr. Lunny.
Mr. Rajat.
Mr. Rajat.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Sorensen.
Mr. Sorensen.
Mr. Schellenberger.
Mr. Schellenberger.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Brown leads Grenville.
Mr. Brown leads Grenville.
Mrs. Greywall.
Mrs. Greywall.
Mr. Hebert.
Mr. Hebert.
Mr. Cramprince Edward Hastings.
Mr. Cramprince Edward Hastings.
Mr. Miller.
Mr. Miller.
Mr. Preston.
Mr. Preston.
Mrs. Smith.
Mrs. Smith.
Mr. Tilson.
Mr. Tilson.
Mr. Trost.
Mr. Trost.
Mr. Tweed.
Mr. Tweed.
Mr. Watson.
Mr. Watson.
Mr. Albrecht.
Mr. Albrecht.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Mr. Lauzon.
Mr. Allen Tibic Mactaquac.
Mr. Allen Tibic Mactaquac.
Monsieur Blanny.
Mr. Blanny.
Mr. Brown Barry.
Mr. Brown Barry.
Mr. Bernouge.
Mr. Bernouge.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Cannon Kelowna Lake Country.
Mr. Cannon Kelowna Lake Country.
Mrs. Davidson.
Mrs. Davidson.
Mr. Fast.
Fast.
Mr. Galipo.
Mr. Galipo.
Mr. Mays.
Mr. Mays.
Mr. Norlock.
Mr. Norlock.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Stanton.
Mr. Stanton.
Mr. Storseth.
Mr. Storseth.
Mr. Sweet.
Mr. Sweet.
Mr. Van Kesteren.
Mr. Van Kesteren.
Mr. Wallace.
Mr. Wallace.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Shear.
Mr. Shear.
Mr. DeVolen.
Mr. DeVolen.
Mr. Clark.
Mr. Clark.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mr. Bowen.
Mr. Bowen.
Mr. Braid.
Mr. Braid.
Ms. Cadman.
Ms. Cadman.
Mr. Calandra.
Mr. Calandra.
Mr. Shorey.
Mr. Shorey.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Hoback.
Ms. Hepner.
Ms. Hepner.
Mr. Holder.
Mr. Holder.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. McColman.
Mr. McColman.
Mrs. O'Neill Gordon.
Mrs. O'Neill Gordon.
Mr. Payne.
Mr. Payne.
Mr. Rathgaber.
Mr. Rathgaber.
Mr. Upal.
Mr. Upal.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Weston, West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country.
Mr. Weston, West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country.
Mr. Weston, St. John.
Mr. Weston, St. John.
Mr. Woodworth.
Mr. Woodworth.
Mr. Young.
Mr. Young.
Mr. Armstrong.
Armstrong.
Mr. Généreux.
Mr. Généreux.
Mr. Sopak.
Mr. Sopak.
Ms. Georges.
Ms. Georges.
Monsieur Arthur.
Monsieur Arthur.
And we await to hear the result, and we all know what it will be. Here's the Speaker, Peter Milliken. He is going to add up the votes, and this will be history, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeas pour 156, 156. Nays contre 145, 145.
Je déclare la motion
carried.
Order.
And there are the papers being thrown out as history is made.
Order.
156 to 145. The Prime Minister is going to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move, seconded by the Government House Leader, that the House do now adjourn.
Seconded by the Government House Leader, that the House do now adjourn.
Mr. Harper, seconded by Mr. Baird, moves that the House do now adjourn. Plaît-il à la Chambre d'adopter?
The pleasure of the House to adopt the motion. Agreed.
Je déclare la motion
I declare the motion carried.
And that is how the Conservative government of Stephen Harper falls. It's defeated. It won't be technically dissolved till he goes to see the Governor General. You see the Liberals now, they've won 156 to 145. And that is history, ladies and gentlemen. That is the first time in Canadian history that on a vote of non-confidence, a government has been found in contempt by Parliament. And this will kick off an election cycle. We are waiting to hear from the Prime Minister. He will speak soon, but you can see as the Speaker walks away, let me bring in Peter Mansbridge.